All right, so for all you philosophy fans out there, the ones who really get a kick out of wrestling with those big fundamental questions, knowledge, reality, how we even make sense of the world around us, well, today we're going to take a deep dive into the work of a thinker who was all about that John Cook Wilson.
Yeah, not exactly a household name, maybe.
Right, not a household name, but his influence, particularly in Oxford philosophy of the early 20th century, really can't be overstated. He was the Wykeham Professor of Logic here, and he was really the leading figure behind what became known as Oxford Realism.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, a real leading figure. And what we're going to be doing today is exploring some of the key ideas of this influential figure who played a crucial role in shifting philosophy away from the idealism that was so dominant at the time.
Exactly, and I think a lot of his ideas still have a lot to say to us today, still relevant to philosophers who are grappling with those same fundamental issues.
I think so too.
Our main source for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Cook Wilson. It's a really thorough piece of work, gives us a lot to work with.
Yeah, it really does.
So we're going to be looking at his views on knowledge and belief, perception, his very interesting take on universals, and his kind of unique and sometimes controversial perspectives on logic and the philosophy of language.
Yeah, unique and controversial is a good way to describe some of his views.
For sure. So let's start with, just setting the scene a little bit, the intellectual context in which Cook Wilson developed his ideas.
Okay.
Born in 1849, he went the typical Oxford route Balliol College, studied classics and mathematics, immersed himself in the works of prominent idealists like T.H. Green and Hermann Lotz.
Classic path.
Yeah, a classic path, for sure. Now, it seems like he was initially drawn to idealism.
He was.
But later on, his philosophical compass shifted, right?
Yeah, it did. Even though he was surrounded by this very strong idealist climate, Cook Wilson himself actually later said that he never fully embraced it.
There was a realist strain in his thinking pretty early on as well. There's evidence he was influenced by Friedrich Überreg's system of logic, which had a realist orientation. But his move away from idealism wasn't, some dramatic overnight conversion.
Right.
It was more of a, as his student H.A. Pritchard put it, a gradual, almost hesitant evolution with his mature realist position really taking shape, fairly late in his career.
Interesting. So it was a slow but decisive kind of shift.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Now, this whole business about him being reluctant to publish, that's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, he preferred circulating these privately printed pamphlets. His Dictata and his major work, Statement and Inference, was actually put together posthumously from lecture notes and these informal writings.
Right, that's right. And this makes trying to really get a handle on his thought a really interesting challenge, I think, especially because his views weren't always laid out in this super systematic, unified way. They could even seem to shift and change across these different texts that were collected after his death.
Yeah, that's a really important point for anyone who really wants to engage deeply with Cook Wilson. I mean, you really have to understand how Statement and Inference came to be. It wasn't conceived as one single meticulously structured work like you sometimes see with great philosophical treatises. It's more like a collection of writings reflecting different stages of his intellectual journey.
Yeah.
So it's less like, reading a polished, finished work and more like looking through these fascinating snapshots of the thinker's evolving thought process.
Right.
With all the, nuances and potential inconsistencies that come with that.
It's kind of like looking through his notebooks.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. So this rawness, though, in a way, gives us this really unique window into how his thinking developed.
Yeah.
Now, one really distinctive feature of Cook Wilson's approach is this deep respect he had for what he called the facts of consciousness. And the insights he believed were embedded in everyday language. And this wasn't just, some casual thing. He genuinely thought that ordinary language contains all these philosophically important distinctions that have been, kind of refined and honed over generations of human experience.
Absolutely. For Cook Wilson, starting with these facts of consciousness, these sort of fundamental experiences we all have, was absolutely crucial. He thought that too much abstract philosophical theorizing often obscured these basic facts. He was very critical of thinkers like F.H. Bradley, for example, for constructing these grand philosophical systems that seemed to be divorced from real-world examples.
Right.
He saw ordinary language as this sort of repository of philosophical wisdom. It reflects all these distinctions that have proven useful over centuries, helping us navigate the complexities of life.
It's pretty striking how this anticipates the later linguistic turn in philosophy, isn't it?
Yeah, it really does.
Like, You can't help but think about J.L. Austin and his famous emphasis on how ordinary language contains distinctions that, as he put it, men have found worth drawing.
Definitely a connection there.
But Cook-Wilson also didn't see ordinary language as the end-all, be-all, right? He didn't think we should just accept it uncritically.
Yeah, he wasn't arguing for this naive view of language. He actually advocated for a very careful examination of particular instances, trying to figure out the underlying principles that guide our use of language. It was a kind of, philosophical induction, similar to what Socrates did with his search for definitions. You start with specific cases, then you look for commonalities, and then you refine your understanding of the underlying concepts. He even thought that this rigorous examination of ordinary language could lead us to, let's say, correct or improve some of our past uses of a particular term if we discovered, a deeper understanding of the nature of the principle that's really at work.
Fascinating. So it's like ordinary language is the first word, but not necessarily the last word? Okay, so let's move on to his epistemology. Cook-Wilson was a firm foundationalist, right? I mean, he was pretty much diametrically opposed to those idealist coherence theories of knowledge where, it's all seen as this web of mutually supporting beliefs.
Yeah. He definitely was.
He believed that, at the end of the day, the justification for our beliefs has to end up in some kind of knowledge that's not derived from other beliefs, which he called apprehension.
Right. He saw apprehension as this immediate, non-inferential grasp of something, kind of like what Aristotle called noesis, or what Bertrand Russell called knowledge by acquaintance. But for Cook-Wilson, it was maybe even broader, encompassing perceptual and non-perceptual cases. A really core idea here is that knowledge can't be built out of belief. For him, knowledge and belief are fundamentally different kinds of mental states.
Right.
Like, think about when you just immediately understand something of a simple truth without having to reason your way there step by step.
Right.
That kind of direct seeing, that's what he considered foundational to all knowledge.
Okay, I see. Now, he also had this rather specific idea about judgment, didn't he? He wasn't quite satisfied with the traditional view in logic that saw judgment as basically just having this subject-predicate structure, which kind of lumped together knowledge, belief, and opinion.
Yeah, he wasn't convinced by that.
Instead, he argued for this more judicial understanding of judgment, tying it really closely to the act of deciding after you've been, in a state of doubt.
Right. So for Cook-Wilson, a judgment wasn't just any old statement you could make. It had to involve this prior state of uncertainty where you were actually weighing different options, deliberating. So if you're just making a statement based on, immediate apprehension where there's no doubt, that wouldn't actually count as a judgment in his view, even though it might have the same grammatical form.
Interesting.
And he also argued that inference, when it's wrongly understood as this decision based on evidence after some deliberation, is actually itself a kind of judgment.
Okay. So this brings us to kind of the heart of his epistemology. This super sharp, fundamental distinction between knowing and believing.
Yes, absolutely.
He was a big proponent of what's called the knowledge first view, arguing that knowledge is what he called sui generis, which basically means of its own kind or unique, and that it can't be defined in terms of belief.
Right. This puts him in the same camp as thinkers like Leonard Nelson and the Brentano school.
Right.
And it's a really central idea in Oxford realism. So for Cook-Wilson, knowing isn't just like a stronger, more intense version of believing. And it's not just belief with some added stuff like justification and truth. They're really different types of mental states. As he put it, they have no highest common factor. He was really against what he saw as these hybrid and externalist accounts that try to define knowledge by starting with belief and then adding things to it.
Yeah, I see.
For him, the real difference isn't about how confident you are or how much evidence you have.
J.L. Austin's famous example of seeing a pig really helps to illustrate this, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Like the moment you actually see the pig, the question of whether or not there's a pig there is just settled. It's completely different from, inferring that there might be a pig around based on, say, the smell.
Exactly. There's a pig, you see it. End of story.
Right. And this gets to that idea that knowledge is what philosophers call factive, meaning that if you know something, then that thing has to be true.
Right.
Which is a key part of Cook-Wilson's view. But this leads to a pretty tricky question, doesn't it?
It does.
If knowledge is so different from belief, how do we always know when we're actually in a state of knowing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Cook-Wilson came up with this idea of accretion, which is this notion that, in a way, the awareness that you know something is built into the very act of knowing itself.
Okay.
It's kind of like it comes along with it.
Right, right.
And his student, H.A. Pritchard, developed this further with his concept of reflection, suggesting that we can always tell whether we know something or just believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But this whole idea, it generated a lot of debate. For example, John Travis had some real concerns about this accretion idea.
Right.
He argued that even if we look inward and feel absolutely certain that we know something, we can't actually rule out the possibility of being wrong, like being tricked by a clever illusion or something.
Right.
So this poses a real challenge to the idea that knowing always involves knowing that, and it kind of opens the door again to those skeptical arguments that Cook-Wilson was so keen to avoid.
Right, right. Now, Austin, even though he agreed with Cook-Wilson on the whole knowledge first thing and famously resisted this whole project of coming up with some grand theory of knowledge, he eventually kind of moved away from the secretion idea.
He did.
And instead, he focused on the way we use the phrase "I know," how it functions as a kind of guarantee or a warrant for what we're saying.
Yeah, that was a shift in focus.
Okay, let's talk about Cook-Wilson's theory of perception. He was a direct realist, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Meaning he believed that when we perceive something, we're directly in touch with that thing itself, that it exists independently of our minds and isn't in any way created by our consciousness.
Exactly. He was very much against the idealist idea that reality is somehow fundamentally dependent on minds. So for him, when we perceive something like, say, this table in front of us, we're directly apprehending the table itself, not some mental representation of it.
Right.
He really criticized those classic distinctions that you find in a lot of theories of perception, like the act-object distinction and the content-object distinction. He said, we don't perceive some intermediary content in our minds, mental image or something, that stands in for the actual object. We directly apprehend the object out there in the world.
I see. Now, this critique of what he called the objectification of the appearing as appearance, this seems to be a really key part of his argument for direct realism.
It is. Yeah.
He basically thought that the big mistake is when we take how something appears to us and treat that appearance as if it's a separate object of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that creates this representational middleman, right?
Right.
And then we're stuck with this problem of how that mental representation is actually connected to the real thing it's supposed to be representing.
Exactly. He saw that as this fundamental error that leads to all sorts of philosophical headaches. He would ask, how can we ever compare this supposed appearance in our minds to the real object if the only way we have access to the real object is through that appearance?
Right, right.
And this line of thinking leads to an infinite regress of representations, representations of representations of representations. And it also kind of pushes us towards idealism, where the external world becomes more and more epistemically distant.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would happen.
He also said that these representational theories often just beg the question, because even the representative itself has to be apprehended, so you're just pushing the problem back a step.
Right, right. Now, while his followers within Oxford realism, people like Pritchard and H.H. Price, developed their own subtle, sometimes different takes on perception, this core idea of rejecting perceptual intermediaries remained a really central part of their shared realism.
Yeah, a direct consequence of that sharp knowledge-belief distinction.
Yeah. So Cook-Wilson's view was kind of a precursor to what's now called disjunctivism, the idea that veridical perception and hallucination are fundamentally different kinds of mental states, even if they can feel the same from the inside.
Yeah, you can see the seeds of that in his work, for sure.
Okay, let's move on to universals. This is where things get really interesting. Cook-Wilson is often seen as a kind of forerunner to trope theories with his idea of the particularization of the universal.
Right, right.
And this is a pretty big departure from, say, the traditional Platonic or Aristotelian views on universals, isn't it?
It is. So instead of thinking of universals as these abstract entities that exist separately from particular things, Cook-Wilson saw what we call existences, particular things, as being basically bundles of these particularized qualities.
Yeah.
What philosophers nowadays often call tropes. So instead of having this single abstract universal redness that exists in some realm of forms or whatever, separate from all the red objects, there are these individual instances of redness, each one unique to the specific object it's in. So the specific redness of this apple is different from the specific redness of that car, even though they're both red.
Okay, so it's like the redness is kind of embedded in the apple itself.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Now, this is similar to trope theory, but Cook-Wilson's view was a bit different, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. He actually insisted on a kind of identity between the universal and these particularized instances, not just a resemblance.
So it's not just that the apple's redness is similar to the universal redness. They're actually identical in some way.
That was his claim. And it's a pretty tricky one to wrap your head around, to be honest. But the main point is that for him, the universal, like, redness fully characterizes the substance in that respect, but without being some kind of separate underlying thing.
It's immanent, right? It's within the particulars themselves.
Yeah, that's the word.
But this raises a classic philosophical problem, doesn't it? If the universal is completely present in each particular instance, then what's the point of even having the concept of a universal? It seems kind of redundant.
That's a really sharp observation, and it's one of the reasons why Cook-Wilson's specific view hasn't been widely accepted in its original form.
Yeah.
There does seem to be this tension between the idea of these truly particularized qualities and this claim that the universal is identical across all of them. But his main goal was to fight against idealism. He argued that when we apprehend these particularized universals, we're doing it directly, in rebus, in the things themselves. It's not like our minds are doing some kind of combining act where we take separate apprehensions and put them together. We're just directly apprehending this combination of particularized qualities.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. Now, he also had this interesting view about the characteristic being of a universal, didn't he? He said it's basically inexplicable and sui generis. And this was his answer to Plato's third man argument, which is this problem about an infinite regress of universals.
Right. It's a pretty bold claim to say that the very essence of a universal is something we just can't explain. But that was his position.
All right, let's switch gears and talk about his views on logic. He was a pretty staunch defender of Aristotelian logic, wasn't he? And he was quite skeptical of symbolic logic.
He was. He considered those fundamental Aristotelian laws of thought, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, to be absolutely fundamental, almost self-evident. He famously said that to even question these laws would be for thought to commit suicide.
Wow, strong words.
Yeah, he didn't hold back.
Yeah.
Now, even though he did work on his own alternative to symbolic logic, which he called the fractional method, he was really suspicious of those algebraic approaches to logic that people like George Boole were developing. He saw them as this sort of intrusion of mathematics into philosophy, which he didn't think was appropriate. And it seems like he didn't really grasp the full significance of what people like Gottlob Frege and Charles Sanders Peirce were doing with mathematical logic. So he ended up raising some objections that were, well, pretty strong, but ultimately kind of off the mark.
Yeah, his critique of Bertrand Russell's logicist definition of numbers, based on his reading of Plato's concept of unaddable numbers, it's a bit forceful, let's say, even though it seems to be based on a misunderstanding.
Yeah, that's a polite way to put it. He took Plato's idea of isputoiopong, misinterpreted it, and then basically conflated a series of universals with the natural numbers. So he ended up dismissing Russell's whole project as this fantastic chimera. And his arguments against Russell's paradox, which is this really important idea in modern logic, were also based on a misunderstanding of the difference between being a member of a class and being included in a class.
It sounds like formal logic wasn't really his forte.
Yeah, some commentators have even said he was, and I'm quoting here, an execrably bad logician. But to be fair to him, his analysis of Lewis Carroll's paradox of inference was actually quite insightful.
Right. He did have some good insights there.
Yeah. He correctly pointed out that the fallacy is basically trying to treat a rule of inference as if it were just another premise in the argument, which leads to this infinite regress.
Right.
Now, Bernard Bolzano had kind of hinted at this idea earlier, but Cook-Wilson's explanation, especially how he connected it to his broader theory of how we apprehend universals in particular instances of inference, the idea that we grasp the validity of a general rule directly in a specific case that was really valuable.
Yeah.
Gilbert Ryle later used this same idea in his famous distinction between knowing how and knowing that.
Right.
And Cook-Wilson's insistence that all statements are ultimately categorical in form, that influenced Ryle's inference ticket view of conditionals as well.
Okay, so even though he wasn't always on the right track with formal logic, he still had some important insights.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
Now, in terms of his philosophy of language, Cook-Wilson made this interesting distinction between what he called the metaphysical subject and the logical subject of a sentence.
He did.
And he emphasized how the stress we put on certain words can actually change the logical subject.
Right. He noticed that a simple sentence like S is P can actually have different underlying logical and ontological structures depending on the context and, importantly, where you put the emphasis. So the subject-predicate relation might be symmetrical in some cases, depending on what aspect of the situation you're focusing on. But the relationship between a thing and its qualities, that's fundamentally asymmetrical. For example, take the sentence, "The red ball is on the table." If you emphasize the word red, you might be contrasting it with, say, a blue ball, and then red ball becomes the logical subject.
Right.
But metaphysically, the ball is still the real subject, the thing that has the quality of redness.
Okay, I get it.
This subtle distinction actually laid some groundwork for later work in the philosophy of language by people like Austin and P.F. Strawson. In fact, Strawson even named his concept of the attributive tie after Cook-Wilson to acknowledge his influence.
Wow, so his influence really spread.
It did.
And this focus on how the meaning of a sentence can change depending on the context, it kind of anticipates some key ideas in Austin's work, doesn't it? And later on, the work of Charles Travis on occasion sensitivity.
Absolutely. He was already talking about how the same sentence can mean different things and even have different truth values in different contexts. And that's a key insight in pragmatics, the study of how context affects meaning. Even R.G. Collingwood, who had this idea that the meaning of a statement is determined by the question it's supposed to answer, you can see a connection there to Cook-Wilson's emphasis on context.
Okay, so he was really ahead of his time in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways he was.
Finally, let's touch on his views on moral philosophy. His notes on the traditional ontological proof for the existence of God suggest that he thought moral and aesthetic judgments are fundamentally emotional.
Right.
He argued that the feeling of reverence actually implies that there is a divine being.
Interesting.
And maybe even more importantly, his student H.A. Pritchard applied Cook-Wilson's argument about knowledge being sui generis to ethics.
He did.
He argued that the concept of duty is also sui generis, and this led to the development of moral intuitionism, which was a really influential school of thought.
Yeah, a really influential school of thought.
So we can see Cook-Wilson's influence extending beyond epistemology and metaphysics into ethics as well.
For sure. His emphasis on the non-speculative, emotional side of moral and aesthetic experience actually resonates with some contemporary moral realists.
Does.
And Pritchard's use of Cook-Wilson's argument about indefinability in ethics, that became a cornerstone of moral intuitionism, which was a huge part of Oxford philosophy for a big chunk of the 20th century.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into John Cook-Wilson's work, it's clear that his influence was much broader than people sometimes realize. He had a hand in shaping Oxford realism, ordinary language philosophy, and even moral intuitionism.
Absolutely. Even though his name might not be as well known as some of his students, his ideas about knowledge, perception, and the nature of reality, they're still relevant today. He was a major figure in the philosophical landscape of his time.
Definitely. And for you, our listeners who I know love to really dig deep into these philosophical questions, here's a final thought to chew on. Do you think that the knowledge-first approach to epistemology, as sophisticated as it is, has actually managed to fully resolve those really tough questions that Cook-Wilson wrestled with, those questions about how we can be sure we're not mistaken, about the connection between our minds and the world? It's something to think about, maybe even to explore in Cook-Wilson's own writings after you've finished listening to this.
Yeah, that's a great challenge to leave our listeners with. Those fundamental questions, they're always worth revisiting.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep on pondering.